Hello and welcome back. Due to the lack of ridership on public transit, the MTA plans to raise fares and tolls. Ridership still hasn't fully returned to pre pandemic numbers, and this effort may be a solution to reduce budget gaps. Join me to discuss the effect this increase could have on New Yorkers is Policy Communications Director for Riders Alliance, Danny Pearlstein. Danny, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Now, can you first just let everybody know a little bit more about your organization, Riders Alliance?
Sure. The Riders Alliance has been around for 10 years. We are New York's grassroots organization of public transit riders, and we fight for better, more reliable, more affordable subway and bus service.
Now, definitely talking about this is stuff that's a little bit more affordable. The news is out that the MTA may be planning a 5.5% increase to fares and tolls, which would raise the fare from 275 to 350. What were your initial thoughts on this?
A fare hike really doesn't make sense at this time. A dozen years ago, the MTA was put on a program of a fare hike every 2 years. The one 2 years ago didn't happen, and this one shouldn't happen either. Ridership is substantially down. The MTA needs to do everything possible to rebuild, not to turn people away, and certainly shouldn't be adding an additional expense to struggling New Yorkers, overwhelmingly people who need to show up for work in person at the moment of, inflation and everything else that we're seeing.
Now, what could be some of the reasons the MTA may consider raising prices?
Well, the MTA needs money. And they needed money, back a dozen years ago when they started on this program of a fare hike every 2 years. And at the time, they also needed state help. A fare hike was not enough. And right now, the fare hike is not enough either. They need state help as well. But they actually need more state help because a fare hike is not going to do what they wanted to do. It's not going to bring in much money. It's going to deter people from using the system. And really, what they need is a more robust package of revenue. And that's where we're asking the governor to lead. We need Governor Hochul to keep fares flat and to increase service to bring more people into the system.
Now, I definitely want to touch on that because you said they need money. Can you just let everybody know what that money would go towards? Because I know to the average New Yorker, to me, it doesn't seem like the train has changed that much. So can you just let us know what does that money go towards?
Overwhelmingly, the money that the MTA receives goes to pay and benefits for the tens of thousands of transit workers that keep New York moving.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying that. Now, according to NBC News, ridership still hasn't fully returned to pre pandemic levels. The fare increase is part of an effort to close budget gaps. What are some of the reasons New Yorkers are truly just avoiding public transit?
The main driver of low ridership is working from home. I mean, you can see right now I'm sitting in a closet. I'm just one person, but hundreds of thousands of people have changed the way that we live. And the MTA needs to be better than it was before the pandemic to bring ridership back. It needs to, incentivize more trips and to take a greater share of trips that would otherwise happen in cars or other ways. And to do that, it needs to provide better service than it did before the pandemic and more attractive, not less attractive fares. And to do that, we need more revenue from the governor. The MTA can't create money on its own except through a fare hike. But in this case, a fare hike wouldn't bring in much money. Really, it's up to the governor to right the MTA's ship, to save public transit and invest in its future with more frequent service.
Now, I'm really glad that I'm glad that I asked that question. And I'm glad that you said that people are working from home because I completely forgot about that. I just thought, maybe people just don't want to take the train anymore. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, will the rising costs fill in those gaps or will they make New Yorkers avoid the MTA even more now that it's a little bit more expensive?
So the challenge is that New Yorkers have more options than ever before. There are more ways to get around and fewer reasons to go around. And that's problematic for the MTA. That means the MTA can rely less on fares than it used to and needs to rely more on other sources of public revenue, that the governor needs to create a plan to save transit operations and invest in the future of the subway and bus that move the whole city around. Because even as fewer of us are traveling or traveling less often, we all depend on the overwhelming majority of public transit riders who need to show up for work in person to make the city run.
Now, I know like a few months ago, and probably even now, that subway violence was a huge concern for many riders. Would you say that contributes to the reason why people could be avoiding, the MTA?
You know, the subway should be safe, welcoming, and inclusive for all. But for all of the attention on crime and safety problems in the subway, bus ridership isn't any better than subway ridership. And there isn't, as far as anyone knows, a bus crime or violence wave. So I would argue it has nothing to do with safety concerns. That yes, there are safety concerns, but they're not deterring ridership in the way that people argue that they are. Instead, it's overwhelmingly people having fewer places to be.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. Now, we've also seen more police officers on the platform in regards to, I guess, people feeling like, they feel a little bit unsafe on the transit or the trains. Do you think that is helpful at all, just having, police officers on the platforms?
I think what's important is that we don't ask police to do more than they're able to do. So there are, really knotty intersecting crises going on in public transit. There is a housing crisis. There is a crisis of untreated mental illness. There is a crisis of drug addiction. And we see those play out in public space. And the subway is our preeminent public space. So of course we see them in the subway. Police really aren't equipped to deal with those issues. So we need other resources brought to bear to address the root causes of homelessness, mental illness, drug addiction, and other things that really don't have to do with violent people or the quality of the transit service. So while of course it makes sense the police are in the subway, the way they're on the street, the way they're in the park, the way they're in public space, we're asking way too much of police officers if we want them to solve all the problems that we see in the subway.
Now, I'm also curious, could that contribute to the rising cost of fares? I know I initially thought that, oh, they're police officers, on our trains now. Surely they have to be paid for that effort. So could that contribute to what we're seeing now?
So overwhelmingly, the police we see in the subway are NYPD, and they're paid out of the City of New York public budget. So they're not paid for by the MTA budget. There are a small number of MTA police officers, primarily on the commuter railroads, that do come out of the MTA's budget. And a few years ago, former Governor Cuomo wanted to bring more MTA police into the subway, and we may see that in some limited ways. That comes out of the MTA budget. But the overwhelming share of policing that's done in the subway is by the city, at no additional cost to the transit authority.
Okay, thank you so much for even letting me know that, because I initially thought like, oh, maybe that's why we're seeing the rise in the fare. Now you kind of mentioned, and I want to talk about just a little bit more, that you don't think just this idea of violence is contributing to the idea of people feeling unsafe or not wanting to take the trains. I know that for a very long time, even of all ages on social media, people were just kind of afraid to use a train. I know myself, I've said like, oh, I don't want to use a train anymore, even though I kind of had no choice. Can you just talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So I think that, a lot of people were out of the riding habit, and a lot of people were out of the habit of seeing, some of the social problems that are especially visible on the subway, in particular, homelessness. And that, contributed to a lot of the discussion around it, a lot of the political demagoguery we've seen around it. But, tragically, this past year, we've seen a series of sensational crimes take place in the subway. Yet we haven't seen any change in ridership after those instances. We've seen a very gradual increase in ridership throughout the year instead of that. So I really don't think subway ridership is sensitive to those, occasional, very widely reported sensational crimes we see in the transit system. Instead, people are taking transit, as we always have, because it's the most affordable and efficient way to get around. We want to feel safer overwhelmingly, and we want the issues in the transit system addressed, but it's not what's keeping people, off our subways and buses. That primarily is working from home.
Now, I also want to just talk about, the MTA and what they can do to encourage riders to not only, just feel safe to use the subway or, our buses, but to be happy with the service that's being provided. I know that New Yorkers are not shy to say when they are unhappy with something, and we kind of hear it a lot about the MTA or just train service and stuff like that. So what could the MTA do to kind of get people to feel a little bit better about using public transit?
So I want to reframe that just because, we talk about the MTA as this sort of punching bag that everybody loves to hate.
Hmm.
But the MTA is set up that way for a reason, and it's to deflect political accountability from the governor of New York, who controls the MTA. And whoever the governor has been, that person has controlled the MTA since the 1960s when it was created. So the current governor, Kathy Hochul, appoints the membership of the MTA board. She dominates the state budget process that determines how much money there is to spend on transit. And she is the person we should hold responsible for the quality of our transit system. The person who has to implement congestion pricing to fix the subway, and also who has to find new revenue to keep subways and buses running and invest in more frequent service to bring more people into the system so the subway and bus compete better with other ways of getting around, make it more seamless to travel throughout New York, and give people more reasons to get out and go places.
I'm glad that you said that because I do agree the MTA is the public face of it, but you just let us know that there are other people in charge. So thank you so much for that. Now, besides raising the fare for riders, do you know of any other ways the MTA or anybody in charge can fill the money they are missing within the budget?
So the MTA's budget, historically was close to half fares and tolls, or about half fares and tolls. And right now it's about a quarter because of the amount that ridership is down. So we need to figure out a way to find a few $billions additional to plug the gap in the budget. And by we, I mean the governor of New York. The state of New York is immensely wealthy. There are many, many different ways of raising revenue, and there are many ways of moving revenue around to meet our current priorities. For just one example, the gas tax right now is suspended because of high gas prices when Russia invaded Ukraine last spring. It's still suspended. The suspension will run through the end of the year. The MTA typically receives about a third of the gas tax. That money's being made up from other state funds. When the gas tax comes back into effect, the MTA should get its share, but it should also get access to those existing state funds that it's been receiving that the state has made available. And there should be a reevaluation of how the state spends the gas tax. Because frankly, roads didn't need to be made whole. There has been an unprecedented infusion of federal money from the infrastructure bill, the highway bill that the president signed last year, that is more than enough money for New York to build and maintain its roads. And so the money we're raising off gasoline and other ways of traveling around should be invested in public transit, the most affordable and efficient way of getting around. So that's one. But, it's up to the governor to work with the leader of the assemblies and Senate to figure out how to make the MTA whole, keep buses and trains running, and to expand the service that we currently depend on to deliver better for New Yorkers in the wake of the pandemic.
All right, Danny, thank you so much for sharing. I actually did learn a lot. So once again, thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for having me.
Make sure you keep up with all the work Riders Alliance is doing by going to their website at www.ridersalliance.org or follow them on social media across all platforms at Riders Alliance. We'll have to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Open after this.